In response to this virtual declaration of war, as the Reagan administration described it, the Nicaraguan government suspended La Prensa. That led to virtual hysteria in the United States. The Nieman Fellows, the journalism fellows at Harvard, immediately gave the owner of La Prensa, Violeta Chamorro, an award. The Washington Post had a big editorial saying she deserves 10 awards. That's a newspaper of valor. That was the heading. The Murray Kempton, the left liberal columnist in the New York Review, issued a plea to people to provide funds for La Prensa to keep its equipment going, that those funds could be added to the rather substantial CIA subvention to La Prensa ever since 1979, and on and on. What is La Prensa? La Prensa is an interesting newspaper. It's probably unique in history. It's often believed that La Prensa is the newspaper that courageously opposed the Somoza dictatorship. And if you read the press, that's what you would believe. Well, it does have the same name as that newspaper, but that's about where it ends. In 1980, right after the Sandinista Revolution, the owners of La Prensa fired the editor, and 80% of the staff left with him, because the staff and the editor refused to support their pro-Contra policy. Now, the editor and the staff formed another newspaper, El Nuevo Diario, and if a newspaper is constituted of its editor and its staff, that's the old La Prensa. If a newspaper is constituted of the money that's behind it, well, of course, the new La Prensa is the old La Prensa. So you just decide how to decide now what a newspaper is. Is it the staff and the editor, or is it the owners and the equipment? This you'll never read about, but it's a fact. Now, the new La Prensa supports the overthrow of the government by a foreign power, and does it quite openly, and it's funded by the foreign power that is trying to overthrow the government. Now, that's pretty unusual. In fact, I can't think of any remote parallel in the history of the Western democracies. So, for example, during the Second World War, England did not permit Nazi Germany to fund and run a major newspaper in London. And the United States did not permit Japan, say, to dominate, to invest in and run a major newspaper coming out of New York. In fact, we don't have to go that far. England and the United States imposed harsh censorship. They wouldn't even let tiny little dissident newspapers go through the mails or appear, and so on. There's no remote parallel in Western history to this, as far as I can see. This, incidentally, is never mentioned in media commentary. Well, nevertheless, a true civil libertarian will defend La Prensa from harassment, even though this is unique in human history, this fact, because if you're a real civil libertarian, you think that the United States should have allowed Japan and Germany to dominate the American media during the Second World War, if you're a real civil libertarian. We now make the obvious question. I mean, we ask whether the great excitement, virtual hysteria of American intellectuals over La Prensa reflects their libertarian passions, or whether it's because they believe, or whether it's because they're serving power, as a propaganda model predicts. That's a fair question, and there's a test. There's an obvious test, and we all know how to apply it. It's a test that we apply all the time when we look at our enemies. So, for example, suppose you take a look at the productions of the East German Peace Group, or the World Peace Council, which is sort of a communist front organization. You read their publicity, and you'll see that they have a lot of criticisms of the United States, often very valid criticisms. In fact, their critical discussion of repression in the United States and in U.S. dependencies not only is often valid, but it's often the kind of thing that's not reported here. Well, do we honor them for that? No, of course not. We regard them with contempt. And the reason is because we apply a very simple and obvious test. We ask, what do they say about the repression and atrocities for which they're responsible? What do they say about Soviet repression and atrocities? And as soon as we find out the answer to that question, we just simply dismiss them with contempt, rightly. You begin by talking about your own responsibility, and then sort of, on a footnote somewhere, you can talk about the bad things done by other guys. At least if you regard yourself as a moral agent, as somebody worthy of minimal respect and attention. We understand that in the case of our enemies, and we might have enough honesty to apply the same test to ourselves, so let's try it. we can now apply the test. We have this tremendous libertarian passion over La Prensa, the first newspaper in history, to be funded by a foreign power, calling for the overthrow of the government in which it appears, in which it's published. And remember, this is not a major power. It's not like the United States, which was never under threat during the Second World War. This is a poor third world country, which is barely able to survive the attack of a superpower. So we have that, and we can ask how the same press has reacted to other examples of repression during the same period, in fact, in the same area. Well, there are test cases, so let's try a few. Let's take El Salvador, right nearby, except a U.S. client. There once was an independent press in El Salvador, two small newspapers, La Crónica and El Independiente, two small newspapers. They were not supported by a foreign power trying to overthrow the government. They were not particularly left-wing. They were independent, run by businessmen. They sort of challenged the distribution of power. You know, they said maybe we should have some land reform or something like that. Well, they're not around anymore. They're not around because the government that we arm, fund, train, and support sent its security forces to destroy them. One newspaper was eliminated by the simple device of taking an editor and a photojournalist who were in a San Salvador restaurant, taking them out. Security forces went in, took them outside, cut them to pieces with machetes, and left them in a ditch. At that point, the owner fled, and that took care of one newspaper. The second newspaper took a little harder. It took several bombings, three assassination attempts on the editor. Finally, the army surrounded the premises with tanks and then broke in and smashed the place up and destroyed it. They had previously a machine gunning attack had killed a newsboy. At that point, the editor fled. That took care of the second newspaper. Well, that was 8 years ago. So we can now ask how much attention did that receive? That's an example of a violation of freedom of the press, a little more severe than the harassment of La Prensa. Well, there's an answer to that. You can check the New York Times, for example. It has never received one word of mention in the New York Times news columns. It has never received one editorial mention in all of these years. And the same is true of the other media. It simply doesn't matter. These are atrocities committed by our clients, the guys we pay and train to do that sort of thing. So all of a sudden our concern for freedom of the press disappears. Or let's take another U.S. client, in fact the major U.S. client, Israel, which receives by far the major U.S. aid, and is again not a small country under attack by a superpower. Well, here too history has set up some interesting tests. At exactly the same time that Nicaragua suspended La Prensa after the virtual declaration of war in violation of the World Court proceedings, at the very same time, Israel closed down permanently 2 Jerusalem newspapers, Arab newspapers, of course, closed down 2 Jerusalem newspapers on the charge that the security forces had claimed that they were supported by a terrorist group, by a hostile group. Well, that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court judged that that was legitimate because, as it explained in its judgment, no state will ever permit a business, no matter how legitimate it is, that's supported by hostile elements. And although we have freedom of speech in Israel, it does not extend to activities that might threaten the security of the state. Well, how much coverage? That's much more severe than what happened in the La Prensa case. So how much coverage did that get? Well, actually, that did get one mention in the U.S. press. It was mentioned in a letter of mine in the Boston Globe commenting on the hypocrisy of the Nieman Fellows. Notice that they did not give a prize to these editors. In fact, that was never even reported. After the Central America Peace Accords, La Prensa was opened. Right at the time it was opened, Israel closed a Nazareth newspaper, that's inside Israel, closed a Nazareth newspaper permanently on grounds that it was supported again by hostile elements. The editor, again, went to the Supreme Court, pleaded that everything that appeared in the newspaper passed through censorship. That was disregarded on the grounds that if the state says it's supported by hostile elements, that's all that's required. You never need any evidence when the state comes along and says security reasons. The courts just accept it. They also closed a news office in Nablus on the grounds that the editor, who was already in jail, in fact, he was in jail for having alleged, not without charge, without legal charge, on the claim that he had contact with hostile elements. His wife, who had been running the newspapers, claimed that she'd maintained those contacts. They closed the press office. Well, how much coverage did that get in the U.S. press? Answer, as far as I can find, zero.